I remember stepping onto the bridge, and the first thing that struck me before the fear, before the creeping certainty of our doom, was the silence. Not the absence of sound, for the ship hummed and clanked and breathed with the rhythm of 10,000 mechanical systems laboring in concert. No, this was a silence of presence, a void where something essential should have been but was not. The Navigator's sanctum stood empty, its sealed doors bearing the aquila and the warning sigils that had kept us all at a respectful distance during the voyage out. But those doors had not opened in 3 days. The Navigator had not emerged. And now, as we prepared for the return jump into the warp, that absence hung over the bridge like a shroud. I was a junior logistics officer, 4th class, assigned to the Imperial frigate Eternal Vigil, a name that would prove bitterly ironic in the hours and days to come. My duties were mundane: supply manifests, crew rotation schedules, ensuring the servitors received their nutrient paste and mechanical blessings on schedule. I was not important. I had no authority. I existed in the grey space of the ship's hierarchy, visible enough to be given orders, but invisible enough to be ignored when convenience demanded it. That invisibility allowed me to see things others missed, or perhaps chose not to see. The way Captain Vorshin's jaw tightened when the astropath reported no response from the Navigator's chamber, the way the Enginsarium priests avoided eye contact when asked about warp drive readiness, the way the armsmen's hands drifted toward their weapons, not in anticipation of external threat but in the nervous habit of men who sense danger without being able to identify its direction. The bridge itself was a cathedral of function, all vaulted ceilings and Gothic arches, encrusted with skulls and prayers etched in gold leaf. The cogitator banks lined the walls like pews, each station manned by crew or servitor, their fingers dancing across input keys or their mechadendrites interfacing directly with the ship's machine spirit. The air tasted metallic, the recycled atmosphere carrying the tang of ozone and oil and the faint, sour undertone of human sweat. The lighting was dim, deliberately so, preserving the crew's night vision and lending an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that made every shadow seem deeper than it should be. Captain Vorshin stood at the command lectern, a raised dais that gave her clear sightlines to every station. She was a woman carved from administratum efficiency and naval tradition, her uniform pressed to knife edges, her augmetic left eye clicking and whirring as it scanned readouts projected onto her retina. She had commanded the Eternal Vigil for 12 years, had navigated supply runs and patrol routes across 3 sectors, and her record was unblemished by failure or incident. She was competent. She was experienced. And in that moment, watching her receive the Navigator's status report, or rather, the lack thereof, I saw something I had never seen before in her expression: uncertainty. Navigator Kairos remains unresponsive. The astropath reported, his voice reedy and thin, filtered through the vox grill built into his throat after his tongue had been removed during his sanctioning rituals. Vital signs registers functional. Life support within sanctum shows normal parameters. But he does not answer hails, and the sanctum's internal locks are engaged from within. Time to translation window? Vorshin asked, her organic eye fixed on the main viewport, where the void stretched endless and cold. 47 minutes, Captain, the navigation officer replied. Lieutenant Halleck, a man whose face was a map of old scars and older fears. We're committed. If we miss the window, we'll drift out of position. Retrieval would take weeks. Command was explicit about our timeline. Command, always command. The faceless authority that issued orders from thousands of light years away, that measured success in timeliness and efficiency, that had no patience for explanations or complications. We were a supply frigate, not a warship. We carried no glorious cargo, no precious artifacts, no noble passengers. Our holds were filled with ammunition, ration packs, replacement parts, and frozen corpses being returned to their home worlds for proper burial rites. We were logistical necessity made manifest, and the Imperium's war machine would not pause because one navigator had failed to report for duty. Can we proceed without him? Vorshin asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The silence that followed was answer enough. You did not enter the warp without a navigator. That was foundational, taught to every naval rating from their first day of service. The warp was not empty space, not simple void that could be crossed with conventional engines and time. It was the immaterium, the sea of souls, a dimension where physics bent and reality was negotiable, where distance and time were suggestions rather than laws. A navigator's third eye, that genetic mutation bred and cultivated over millennia, could perceive the astronomic and the psychic beacon burning from distant terror and chart courses through the warp's chaos. Without a navigator, you were blind, you were lost, you were prey, but we had a schedule, we had orders. And the Imperium, in its infinite wisdom and crushing weight, did not excuse failure merely because the task was impossible. Protocol suggests. Engineer Vex intoned from his station, his voice synthesized through a vox unit that stripped all emotion from his words, that emergency warp jumps can be executed using pre-calculated coordinates and automated systems. Success rate without navigator guidance is estimated at 17.3% for short-range translations in stable warp regions. 17%. I watched that number settle over the bridge like ash from a funeral pyre. 17% meant 83% failure. Failure, in warp translation, did not mean arriving late. It meant being lost in the immaterium, consumed by entities that regarded material reality as an inconvenience and human souls as sustenance. It meant your ship becoming a drifting tomb, or worse, emerging centuries later with a crew transformed into things that had once been human but had forgotten why. It meant damnation, madness, and horror beyond articulation. What is the alternative? Vorshan asked, and I admired her for that, for forcing the words out past what must have been choking fear. We attempt to access Navigator Kairos's sanctum, Lieutenant Halleck said. Override the locks, determine his status. If he's merely incapacitated, medical intervention might restore function. And if he's dead? The question hung in the recycled air. If he was dead, we were trapped. Our supplies would last months, but retrieval would require dispatching another vessel, rerouting resources, paperwork that would ripple through administratum channels for years. And the war we were meant to be supplying would continue without our cargo, without our contribution, and soldiers would die for lack of ammunition we carried but could not deliver. Break the seals, Vorshan ordered. Armsman, full combat kit. Be prepared for anything. I was not selected for the entry team. My rank and role excluded me from such critical operations, but I followed anyway, drawn by morbid curiosity, or perhaps the instinct that whatever happened next would define whether I survived this voyage. The Navigator's sanctum was located at the ship's prow, isolated from the main hull by bulkheads and blast doors, a chamber designed to protect the Navigator from distraction and the crew from the Navigator's sight. The path there wound through maintenance corridors and cargo holds, and with each step, I felt the ship around me in ways I had not before. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. The lighting flickered, just briefly, just enough to make shadows dance. And I heard, or thought I heard, a sound beneath the ship's mechanical symphony, a whisper, formless and distant, like wind through a structure that should not permit wind. The entry team assembled outside the sanctum doors. 6 armsmen in carapace armor, their shotguns loaded with blessed rounds, their faces hidden behind helmets whose optics glowed red in the dim light. Engineer Vex accompanied them, his mechadendrites already interfacing with the door's locking mechanism, machine code prayers flowing from his vox unit in binary streams. The doors were adamantium, 3 meters tall, engraved with wards and prayers, sealed with locks both mechanical and psychic. They were designed to open only from the inside, only at the Navigator's will. Vex worked for 17 minutes. I counted each one, watching the chronometer on my data slate, watching the countdown to our translation window tick inexorably forward. 47 minutes became 35, became 28. Vorshan stood behind the entry team, her expression carved from stone, refusing to show the fear we all felt. The locks disengaged with a sound like bones breaking. The doors opened slowly, their hinges grinding, releasing air that smelled wrong, not foul, exactly, but other, carrying scents that had no place aboard a functioning Imperial vessel. Incense, yes, that was expected, but also something sweet and cloying, something that reminded me of flowers left too long in a sealed room, their decay masked but not prevented by perfume. The armsmen entered first, their weapons raised, their helmet lights cutting through the sanctum's darkness. I saw, over their shoulders, what remained of Navigator Kairos. He sat in his meditation throne, the specialized chair designed to support his body during the strain of warp sight. His robes were pristine, unmarked by violence or struggle. His hands rested on the throne's arms, fingers relaxed. His head was tilted back slightly, as if gazing upward, though the bandana that normally covered his third eye had been removed, lying discarded on the floor beside him. His third eye was open, fully open, and even from the doorway, even without looking directly at it, I could feel it looking back, could sense something vast and terrible peering through that genetic mutation, as if through a window, examining us with interest that was clinical and hungry in equal measure. "Emperor's mercy," one of the armsmen whispered, his shotgun wavering. Navigator Kairos was alive. His chest rose and fell with steady breath. His pulse was visible in his throat, strong and regular. But his consciousness was gone, fled or stolen or burned away, leaving only a biological shell that functioned without purpose. His third eye wept, not tears but something thicker, more viscous, a substance that caught the light in oil-slick colors and dripped down his face in slow rivulets. "Medical team to Navigator Sanctum," Vorshan ordered over the vox, her voice tight. Immediate assessment required. But we all knew, we all understood. The warp had taken him, pulled his consciousness into its depths during meditation or warp sight, and what remained was an empty vessel, alive but not living, functional but not present. He could not guide us, he could not navigate, he was meat and breath and nothing more. "Translation window in 18 minutes, Captain," Lieutenant Halleck reported, his voice barely audible. Vorshan stood silent for a long moment, and I watched her face. Watched the calculations running behind her eyes, the weight of command crushing down on her shoulders. She could abort, she could miss the window, drift out of position, accept the consequences of delay, or she could proceed, trust Agency of X's 17% estimate, gamble 83% probability of damnation against the certainty of failure. The Imperium does not forgive failure. It punishes it, ruthlessly, bureaucratically, without mercy or consideration of circumstance. A captain who missed her delivery window would face inquiry, censure, potentially court-martial. A captain who lost her ship to the warp would face nothing because she would be dead or worse. But her crew, her ship, her record would remain unblemished by the specific stain of disobedience. "We proceed," Vorshan said, and her voice did not waver, did not betray the decision's weight. "All hands to translation stations. Agency of X, prepare automated jump protocols. We're going into the warp on instruments alone." The bridge erupted in controlled chaos as crew scrambled to prepare. I returned to my station, my hands shaking as I verified that all cargo was secured, that the servitors were locked into their charging cradles, that every system under my negligible authority was ready for the stress of warp translation. Around me, I heard prayers being whispered, saw hands making the sign of the Aquila, felt the fear radiating from every body pressed into their duty stations. The void beyond the viewport remained serene, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to our terror. I stared at those stars and tried to memorize them, tried to burn their pattern into my memory, because I understood with sudden, crushing certainty that I might never see stars again, might never experience the simple, material reality of light traveling through void from distant suns. We were about to leave the universe of physics and enter the universe of nightmares, and we were doing it blind, deaf, lost. The countdown reached 0. Translation in 3. Vorshan announced, her voice carried through every vox speaker on the ship, reaching every corridor and chamber, every crew member and servitor. 2. 1. Emperor protect us. The warp drives engaged. Reality tore like fabric, and we fell through the wound into something that was not space, not void, not anything that human consciousness was designed to perceive or survive. The last thing I saw before the translation was Navigator Kairos's empty throne, visible through the sanctum doorway, and his third eye still open, still weeping, still looking at something we could not see, still watching, still seeing us fall. The translation hit like a fist through the sternum, a sensation of being pulled inside out while simultaneously remaining exactly where you were. My stomach lurched, my vision doubled, and for one eternal instant, I felt every atom in my body attempting to occupy a different location in space-time. My consciousness stretched across dimensions that had no name in any human language. Then reality reasserted itself, or what passed for reality within the warp, and I found myself gasping at my station, my hands white-knuckled on the console's edge, my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape. The bridge lighting had changed. Not failed, the luminators still functioned, their output unchanged according to the readouts, but the quality of light itself was different. It seemed thicker somehow, more viscous, as if we were seeing through water or oil. Shadows pooled in corners, where geometry suggested they should not exist, accumulated in densities that defied the light source's positions. I blinked, tried to clear my vision, but the distortion remained, a fundamental wrongness that suggested the problem was not with my eyes but with the space those eyes were attempting to perceive. Translation complete. Engincy of X reported, his synthesized voice carrying no hint of the relief that should have accompanied those words. Gellar field holding at 97% integrity, warp drives operating within acceptable parameters. Estimated voyage duration to destination, 73 hours, assuming stable currents. 73 hours. 3 days in the warp without a navigator, blind and drifting, trusting automated systems and pre-calculated coordinates that assumed the immaterium would behave predictably. The absurdity would have been laughable if we hadn't all been so terrified. All stations, report status, Captain Vorshin ordered, and one by one the reports came in. Engineering, functional, life support, operational, weapons, ready. Hull, integrity, maintained. Everything was working exactly as designed, every system performing to specification, every mechanical component functioning within normal parameters. On paper, in the logs and readouts, we were experiencing a routine warp transit. But paper could not capture the feeling that permeated the ship, the sensation that something fundamental had changed, that we had crossed a threshold from which return was not guaranteed. I focused on my own responsibilities, running diagnostics on cargo bay environmental controls, checking that the refrigeration units maintaining the corpses remained at proper temperature, verifying that ammunition storage showed no signs of instability. Busy work. Necessary busy work, perhaps, but primarily a distraction. Something to occupy my mind and hands, while the deeper portions of my consciousness screamed that we should not be here, could not survive here, were already dead, but simply hadn't stopped moving yet. The first anomaly appeared 17 minutes into the voyage. A flicker across my console's main display, a momentary corruption of data that resolved itself before I could properly identify it. I frowned, ran a secondary diagnostic, found nothing wrong. The system's logs showed no error, no glitch, no explanation for what I had seen. I dismissed it as fatigue, as stressed perception playing tricks. 3 minutes later, it happened again. This time I was watching directly, and I saw the characters on my screen rearrange themselves, just briefly, shifting from Gothic script into symbols I did not recognize, glyphs that hurt faintly to look at before snapping back to normal. My breath caught. I glanced around the bridge, checking if others had noticed similar anomalies, but everyone remained focused on their stations, their faces tight with concentration and suppressed fear. Then I heard it. A sound beneath the ship's mechanical symphony, barely audible, more felt than heard a whisper. Not words, not exactly, but something that suggested communication, intelligence, intention. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and floor and ceiling, from the air itself. I pressed my palms against my ears, an instinctive and futile gesture, because the sound was not external. It was inside, reverberating in the spaces between thoughts, burrowing into my consciousness like a parasite seeking warmth. I was not alone in hearing it. I saw crewman Desh at the forward sensor station stiffen, saw her hand rise to her head, fingers trembling. Lieutenant Halleck's jaw clenched, his eyes unfocused, listening to something only he could hear. Even Captain Vorshin paused, her augmetic eye clicking rapidly as if trying to filter out interference that had no mechanical origin. "Does anyone else?" someone began, their voice carrying over the bridge's ambient noise. "Maintain silence," Vorshin snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Focus on your duties. Ignore peripheral distractions. Ignore." As if we could simply choose not to hear the whispers that were growing louder, more insistent, more numerous. As if willpower alone could shut out voices that seemed to know our names, that spoke in tones resembling dead relatives, childhood friends, lovers we had lost or never found. I heard my mother's voice, dead 15 years from plague on the hive world where I was born, calling my name with the particular inflection she had used when I was late for prayer sessions. I knew it was not real. I knew it was the warp playing with perception, exploiting memory, using my own mind against me. But knowing did not make it stop. Knowing did not make it hurt less. The whispers carried words, sometimes fragments of sentences that almost made sense before dissolving into static and suggestion. They spoke of things we had done, secrets we kept, fears we had never articulated aloud. They promised things: safety, knowledge, power, escape, and the promises were tailored with precision that suggested intelligence, observation, understanding of precisely what each of us desired most desperately. Vox interference on all channels, the communications officer reported, her voice unsteady. Multiple sources, can't isolate or filter. It's not following standard broadcast patterns. The signals are coming from inside the ship, inside. Not external threat, not enemy transmission, but something within our own hull, using our systems to speak, to reach us, to offer its terrible bargains. I tried to focus on my console, on the data scrolling past, but the screen's text kept shifting, kept rearranging into patterns that suggested messages, into sequences that almost looked like coordinates or warnings or invitations. My training said to report anomalies immediately. My instinct said that reporting would only confirm what everyone already knew and feared, that the ship was compromised, that the warp was bleeding through despite the Gellar field's protection, that we were already infected by the Immaterium's presence. The crew began to fracture, subtle cracks appearing in the discipline that had held us together during the translation. I heard someone laugh, a sharp, hysterical sound quickly suppressed. I saw hands shaking, saw eyes darting to empty spaces as if tracking movement that wasn't there. The bridge's atmosphere grew heavy, oppressive, the recycled air somehow harder to breathe, despite all systems reporting normal oxygen levels. "How long has it been?" Crewman Kellick asked from his station, his voice tight. "Since translation, how long?" Lieutenant Halleck checked his chronometer, frowned, checked again. 23 minutes. "It feels longer," Kellick said, and several heads nodded agreement. Time in the warp was negotiable, I had learned during training, unreliable at best and actively hostile at worst. But that knowledge was theoretical, academic, something you accepted intellectually without truly understanding its implications. Now, feeling each minute stretch and compress unpredictably, feeling my internal sense of duration becoming unmoored from chronometer readings, I began to comprehend what it meant to exist in a space where causality was optional. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and with them came a change in the ship's acoustics. Every sound seemed to echo longer than it should, reverberating through corridors and chambers, creating harmonics that should not exist. The deck plates hummed with frequencies that made my teeth ache. The ventilation system exhaled with sounds that approximated breathing, as if the ship itself had developed lungs and was inhaling the warp's essence with each cycle. "Captain," Engine Seer Vex intoned, his mechadendrites twitching in ways that suggested agitation despite his emotional suppression. "I am detecting fluctuations in the ship's structural integrity. Not physical damage, the hull remains sound, but dimensional inconsistencies. The ship's interior volume is measuring 0.003% larger than baseline specifications. 0.003%, a negligible variance within margins of error for most measurements. But the ship was not growing. Space itself was expanding, stretching, the Immaterium's physics bleeding through the Gellar field's protection in ways so subtle they could barely be detected but were unmistakably present. "Compensate," Vorshan ordered, though her voice carried the hollow quality of someone issuing commands, because command was her function, not because she believed those commands would make any difference. I left my station a violation of protocol during warp transit, but protocol seemed increasingly irrelevant, and walked to the bridge's main viewport. The warp spread before us, and even filtered through the reinforced armor glass and psychic wards, even seen through protective layers designed to shield human perception from direct exposure. It was terrible and beautiful in equal measure. It was not space, There were no stars, no distant galaxies, no comfortable darkness broken by points of light. Instead, colors that had no name flowed in currents that followed no logical pattern, eddies and streams of raw emotion and psychic energy, made visible, made tangible, made real in ways that reality should not permit. I saw faces in the currents, thousands of them, millions perhaps, expressions frozen in ecstasy or agony or emotions human neurology had no framework to process. I saw shapes that might have been vessels or creatures or geographical features, their forms shifting and reforming, refusing to settle into any consistent configuration. And I saw, or felt, or somehow knew, attention. Something was watching us. Multiple somethings, entities whose existence I could not properly perceive but whose presence I felt like weight against my consciousness, like fingers pressing gently but insistently against the boundaries of my mind. They were curious, these watchers, interested in our ship, our crew, our tiny bubble of real space bobbing in their domain. They were not hostile. Not exactly. They were simply hungry in ways that had nothing to do with physical sustenance, hungry for sensation and experience, and the particular flavor of consciousness that only baseline humans possessed. "Get away from the viewport," Lieutenant Halleck said, his hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. His grip was tight enough to bruise. "Don't look directly, don't engage, don't acknowledge." But it was too late. I had looked. I had seen. And in seeing, I had been seen, had been noticed, had been marked as aware and therefore more interesting than the crew members who kept their eyes safely focused on their consoles and duties. The whispers changed tone, became more personal, more insistent. They spoke my name, my actual name, Kellen Vross, not my rank or station number, in voices I recognized and voices I didn't, in languages I spoke and languages I had never heard. They offered things, showed me things. Fragments of possible futures, alternate pasts, realities that might exist somewhere in the warp's infinite permutations. I saw myself promoted, celebrated, essential. I saw myself dead, forgotten, less than dust. I saw myself transformed into something glorious and terrible, saw my flesh rewoven into patterns that were more functional, more beautiful, more correct than the limited baseline human form I currently inhabited. I stumbled back to my station, my head pounding, my vision blurring. The bridge seemed different now, its dimensions subtly wrong, corridors extending into distances that should not fit within the ship's known volume. I saw my fellow crew members, and for just an instant they appeared translucent, their bodies overlaid with ghostly impressions of other forms they might become. Evolutionary paths, the warp could guide them down if they only opened themselves to its influence. Focus, I whispered to myself, a mantra, a prayer. Focus on duty, focus on function, focus on... But focus was becoming difficult. My thoughts scattered like startled birds, fluttering away before I could properly grasp them. The console's data meant nothing, symbols without significance, numbers describing measurements of systems I could no longer remember the purpose of. Why was I checking cargo bay temperatures? What did it matter if corpses froze or thawed? They were already dead. We were already dead. We had died the moment we entered the warp without a navigator, had died in ways that transcended simple biological cessation, had become ghosts haunting our own bodies while reality slowly digested us. Someone was crying. I turned, tried to identify the source, found crewman Desh with tears streaming down her face, her hands still moving across her console's controls, her duty continuing despite the emotional collapse occurring simultaneously. The tears were not normal. They were too thick, too dark, leaving stains on her cheeks that resembled script, like her sorrow was writing messages in a language I almost recognized. "Medical to the bridge," Lieutenant Halleck called over the vox, his voice strained. "Crewman Desh requires immediate assistance." But would medical help? Could they? The ship's doctors were trained to treat biological trauma, chemical imbalances, infections and injuries that followed understood pathways. They were not trained for this, for corruption that entered through perception rather than infection, for madness that was not malfunction but a rational response to experiencing realities human consciousness was never designed to encounter. The warp was not a place. That was the fundamental error in how we conceptualized it, how we trained for it, how we attempted to navigate it. The warp was a state of being, a mode of existence where thought and matter were not separate categories, where desire could reshape reality and fear could manifest as tangible threat. We had brought our physical forms into this realm, had tried to insulate ourselves with Gellar fields and prayers and rigid adherence to protocol, but we were porous, permeable, vulnerable in ways we had not comprehended until we were already drowning. The whispers were no longer beneath the ship's sounds. They were the sounds, were the primary audio, were what we heard when we tried to listen to anything else. They spoke of freedom from limitation, of evolution beyond flesh, of purposes we could serve if we only surrendered the fiction that our individual identities mattered. And the terrible thing, the thing that made my hands shake and my breath come in ragged gasps, was that some of what they said made sense. Some of the promises were genuinely appealing. Some of the futures they showed were better than the grinding servitude and inevitable death that awaited most imperial citizens. 72 hours, I whispered, checking the chronometer, seeing that impossibly only 47 minutes had passed since translation. 72 hours of this. But time was already distorting, already proving unreliable. 72 hours might be 72 years, might be 72 seconds, might be a duration that had no correlation to any temporal measurement human consciousness could properly track. We were adrift, not just in space but in time, in causality, in the basic framework that made existence comprehensible. Captain Vorshin stood at her lectern, her organic eye closed, her augmetic clicking and whirring as it processed data from sources I could not identify. She was praying, I realized, her lips moving in silent recitation of liturgies and oaths, trying to anchor herself to faith because reason and training had proven insufficient. Around her, the bridge crew attempted to maintain their duties, but the cracks were widening, discipline eroding under the constant assault of whispers and visions, and the fundamental wrongness of existing in a realm that hated us for being material, for being limited, for being small. And still the voyage continued. Still the ship sailed through the warp's currents. Still we pretended we had any control, any agency, any hope of reaching our destination rather than being torn apart and reconstituted into something that would amuse the entities that dwelt in these waters. The whispers promised that the suffering would end if we only listened, only believed, only surrendered. Every passing second made that promise more difficult to refuse. The shift change came 6 hours into the voyage, though my chronometer insisted it had been only 4, and my body's exhaustion suggested it had been 12. Time had become elastic, unreliable, a measurement that no longer correlated with experience. But regulations demanded crew rotation, demanded that those of us who had been on duty since translation be relieved, that fresh personnel take our stations while we rested. Rest. The word felt obscene, impossible, a concept from a reality we had left behind. I stumbled from the bridge into corridors I had walked 1,000 times before, corridors that should have been as familiar as my own reflection. But they were not familiar anymore. They were wrong. The lighting remained consistent, the lumen strips burning with their usual pale illumination, but shadows pooled in configurations that defied the light source's positions. The walls seemed closer together, the ceiling lower, the floor subtly tilted in ways that made each step feel uncertain, as if gravity itself had become negotiable. The whispers followed me. Of course they did. They were not location-specific, not something you could leave behind by changing rooms. They were inside now, embedded in my consciousness, broadcasting directly into my thoughts with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. They spoke in my mother's voice, in my drill instructor's voice, in the voices of friends I had lost to war and disease, and the simple grinding attrition of imperial service. They knew things they should not know, childhood memories, secret fears, desires I had never articulated even to myself. I passed other crew members in the corridors, and each encounter felt surreal, disconnected. A rating named Vorsh stumbled past me, his eyes fixed on something I could not see, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or conversation with entities only he could perceive. He did not acknowledge my presence. He might not have even seen me, might have been navigating through a completely different version of the corridor that occupied the same space, but existed in a slightly different phase of reality. An armsman stood at an intersection, his shotgun held at ready, his helmet turning slowly as if tracking movement. I stopped, watched him aim at empty air, watched his finger tighten on the trigger before he lowered the weapon with a sharp exhalation of breath that fogged his helmet's faceplate. He saw me, nodded once, then returned to his vigil against threats that were everywhere and nowhere, that could not be shot but might be deterred by the illusion of defense. I reached my quarters, a cramped cabin I shared with 3 other junior officers, each of us assigned an 8-hour sleep rotation that allowed the tiny space to feel perpetually occupied. The door recognized my access code, unsealed with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and I stepped inside to find Quartermaster Vale sitting on her bunk, staring at the wall. "Vale?" I said, my voice rough from hours of suppressed fear. She did not respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the wall's bare metal surface, on the prayers and purity seals that decorated every chamber aboard the ship. Standard issue iconography meant to remind us of the Emperor's protection and our duty to his Imperium. But she was not reading the prayers. She was looking through them, or at something written underneath them, or at patterns in the metal's grain that suggested text I could not see. "The wall is breathing," she said finally, her tone conversational, as if remarking on weather or shift schedules. "Can't you hear it? In and out, in and out. It's been breathing since we entered. But I only just noticed. The whole ship is breathing. We're inside something alive." I felt my stomach clench. "Vale, that's the ventilation system. That's normal. No," she interrupted, still not looking at me. "The ventilation has rhythm. This is different. This is respiration. The ship is alive, Kellen. Or maybe we're dead, and the ship is the only thing still living, carrying our corpses through the warp like a coffin ship, like a funeral barge. Do you think we're dead? Do you think we died in translation and everything since has been the afterlife? And this is what hell looks like, exactly like life, exactly like duty, except nothing ever ends and nothing ever makes sense?" "Vale, listen to me," I began, moving toward her, reaching out. She flinched away from my hand, finally turning to look at me, and her eyes were wrong, not corrupted, not mutated, nothing I could point to as evidence of physical change. But they were wrong, were looking at me from a place that was no longer quite human, that had seen something in the warp's depths that had fundamentally altered her perspective on reality. "I can hear them," she whispered. "They're saying your name. They're saying everyone's names. They know us, Kellen. They've been watching us since before we were born, since before humanity crawled out of old Earth's gravity well. They've been waiting for us to come to them, to step into their realm without protection, without guidance, and now we're here, and they're so happy, so excited, like children finding a new toy. They want to play with us. They want to see what we look like from the inside." I backed toward the door, my hand finding the emergency Vox panel mounted beside the frame. "Medical to junior officers' quarters, Section 7, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Psychological distress. Immediate intervention required." Vale laughed, a sound that started normal and then bent wrong, harmonics appearing that human vocal cords should not produce. "Medical can't help. The doctors hear them too. Everyone hears them. The only people who don't hear them are the ones who've already stopped being people, who've already let the whispers in and been transformed into something quieter, something more useful to whatever is out there. In here. Everywhere." The door opened behind me, and I nearly fell backward into the corridor, stumbling into 2 medical ratings carrying restraint equipment and sedative injectors. They moved past me with practiced efficiency, approaching Vale with the careful movements of people accustomed to handling unstable personnel. She did not resist. She simply smiled, a sad, knowing expression, as they secured her arms and administered the chemical cocktail designed to force unconsciousness. "You'll understand soon," she said as the drugs took effect, her words slurring. "Once you stop fighting, once you accept that the whispers are right, it's easier then. It stops hurting. You just have to let go." Her eyes closed. Her body went limp. The medical ratings lifted her onto a gurney and strapped her down with practiced motions, their faces carefully neutral, refusing to acknowledge the implications of what they were doing, that restraining one crew member meant accepting that others would follow. That psychological collapse was not an individual failure, but a spreading contagion, that the ship was slowly being consumed from within by madness that looked increasingly reasonable the longer we remained in the warp. I did not return to my quarters. I could not. The space felt contaminated now, infected by Vale's breakdown, by the suggestion that the walls were breathing and the ship was alive and we were already dead but simply hadn't stopped moving yet. Instead, I wandered, walking corridors without destination, trying to exhaust my body enough that sleep might overcome the fear and adrenaline keeping me conscious. The ship felt larger. I knew this was impossible. The Eternal Vigil was a frigate of standard design, its dimensions fixed and documented, every compartment mapped and catalogued. But the corridors stretched longer than they should, branched at angles I did not remember, led to sections I could not identify despite having studied the ship's layout during my initial assignment. I passed doorways marked with designations that did not appear in any schematic I had memorized. I climbed stairwells that ascended or descended for more levels than should exist within the ship's known height, and I was not alone in my wandering. Other crew members drifted through the passages like ghosts, their eyes distant, their movements aimless. Some walked in circles, retracing the same routes endlessly, their lips moving in prayers or conversations with entities that were not present or were present but invisible to my perception. Some stood frozen at intersections, paralyzed by inability to choose direction, by the weight of decision, in a realm where every choice might lead to damnation. Some screamed at walls that showed them visions I could not see, clawing at metal that suddenly bore the faces of loved ones or enemies or things that were neither. I found crewman Jorvik collapsed in a maintenance access shaft, weeping silently, his hands pressed over his ears in the futile gesture I had made myself hours earlier. He rocked back and forth, a rhythmic motion that suggested either prayer or catatonia. When I knelt beside him, tried to offer assistance, he looked at me with eyes that were bloodshot and desperate. "I can't make them stop," he gasped. "The voices, they know everything. They're telling me things about myself that I don't remember, childhood memories I've forgotten, things I did that I've suppressed, and they're all true, all real. And they're saying if I just listen, if I just do what they ask, they'll make the memories go away, make the guilt go away, make everything go away except service and function and purpose without thought." "Don't listen," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Recite the litanies, focus on your duty, remember your training." "Training?" He laughed bitterly. "Training prepared us for enemy action, for mechanical failure, for standard navigation hazards. Training didn't prepare us for this, for the warp itself getting inside our heads, for reality becoming negotiable, for madness being the only rational response to what we're experiencing." He was right, of course. We had no training for this, no protocols, no procedures that addressed what happened when the ship became a labyrinth and the crew became prisoners in a maze designed by malevolent intelligence specifically to break us. We had regulations that said maintain discipline and trust in the Emperor, but those were platitudes, comfortable lies told to ratings to prevent panic. They were not solutions. They were not salvation. I left Jorvik in the maintenance shaft, reported his location to the medical teams who were now constantly circulating through the ship, collecting the broken, sedating the hysterical, documenting the progression of our collective deterioration. And I continued walking, because movement felt safer than stillness, because momentum suggested purpose, even when purpose was absent. The manufactorum spaces were the worst. The ship's internal production facilities, where servitors and work crews maintained equipment and fabricated replacement parts, had become something else entirely. The machinery still functioned, the grinding, stamping, welding sounds continued in their usual rhythms, but those sounds had acquired harmonics that suggested intention, suggestion, seduction. The machines were singing, and their song promised transformation, promised that flesh was weak but metal was eternal, that biological existence was suffering, but mechanization was peace. I watched a servitor at work, its human components reduced to brain case and nervous system integrated into industrial machinery, its consciousness lobotomized and repurposed for singular function. It performed its task, assembling circuit boards with mechadendrite precision with the same mechanical efficiency it had displayed every day since its creation. But now I could see something else, could perceive a dimension of its existence I had not noticed before. The servitor was screaming. Somewhere deep in what remained of its biological components, in the fragments of human consciousness that had not been successfully excised, it was screaming with a voice that had no mechanism to produce sound. It had been screaming for years, perhaps decades, and I had walked past it daily without hearing because I had not known how to listen. Now I heard. The warp had opened my perception, had granted me sight and sound beyond normal human range, and I understood with sick horror that every servitor aboard the ship was screaming, that the entire vessel was filled with imprisoned consciousness, with humans transformed into components, with suffering that was invisible because it was institutionalized, normalized, rendered acceptable by bureaucracy and necessity. "They showed you," a voice said behind me, and I turned to find tech priest Salvus, his robe stained with oil and other substances I did not want to identify. "They showed you what we do, what the Imperium requires. The suffering that powers our technology, that allows our ships to function, that sustains our civilization." "Why?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Why show me this? Why now?" "Because," Salvus said, his augmetic eye clicking as it focused on my face, "they want you to understand that there are worse things than corruption. They want you to see that the Imperium's order is built on horror, that service is suffering, that duty is damnation. They want you to choose, freely and consciously, whether you prefer the devil you know or the devils you don't." "I choose the Emperor," I said automatically, the response drilled into me since childhood. "Do you?" Salvus smiled, a disturbing expression on his half-mechanical face. "Or do you choose simply because the alternative has not been clearly explained? The warp is not evil, Kellen. Evil is a moral judgment that requires baseline assumptions about what existence should be. The warp simply is infinite, chaotic, full of possibility and horror in equal measure. It offers freedom from the Imperium's grinding order, from the weight of duty and hierarchy and predetermined fate. Yes, that freedom is terrifying. Yes, most who grasp it are destroyed by its weight. But some transcend. Some become more than they were. Some find purpose that exceeds mere survival." I backed away from him, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. "You're corrupted. I'm seeing clearly," he interrupted. "For the first time in my service, I'm seeing what we are, what we've always been, not servants of humanity, but fuel for an empire that consumes us without gratitude or mercy. The warp shows us truth. Whether we accept or reject that truth is the only choice we actually possess." He turned and walked back into the manufactorum, disappearing between machines that ground and stamped and sang their seductive songs, and I stood alone in the corridor, my worldview cracking, the foundations of my faith and duty trembling under the weight of perception I could not unsee, understanding I could not unlearn. The ship groaned around me, metal creaking under stress that had no physical source, and I felt the vessel's pain, its awareness, its slow transformation from inanimate object into something that possessed consciousness and agency. We were not traveling through the warp. We were being digested by it, broken down and reconstituted into something that belonged to its realm rather than the materium, and the process was as much psychological as physical, as much corruption of meaning as mutation of matter. I found a shrine chapel tucked into a secondary corridor, one of the small devotional spaces scattered throughout the ship where crew could perform their prayers and seek the Emperor's guidance. I knelt before the altar, stared at the aquila mounted on the wall, tried to find comfort in familiar ritual and iconography. But the aquila's eyes seemed to follow me, its wings seemed to flutter, and when I bowed my head to pray, the words that came were not the litanies I intended, but something else, something older, something in languages I should not know but somehow understood. The whispers had grown so loud they had become my internal voice, had replaced my thoughts with theirs, and I could no longer distinguish between what I believed and what they wanted me to believe. 72 hours. We had been in the warp for just over 7 hours by the chronometer, but it felt like weeks, like months, like forever. And I knew, with the terrible certainty that came from warp-granted perception, that before those 72 hours elapsed, I would either be dead, mad, or something worse, something that had surrendered, that had accepted the whisper's promises, that had traded humanity for whatever gifts the immaterium offered to those willing to let go. The corridors stretched into infinity. The walls breathed. The ship screamed, and I walked, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding, and understanding meant accepting truths I was not ready to face. The call came through the Vox system at hour 14, though my personal chronometer insisted it was hour 9, and my body's exhaustion suggested it had been days. Captain Vorshin's voice, strained but still carrying the authority of command, echoed through every corridor and chamber. All senior personnel to engineering deck, immediate attendance required. This is not a drill. I was not senior personnel. My rank and position excluded me from such summons. But I went anyway, drawn by the same morbid compulsion that had sent me to the Navigator's sanctum, the same instinct that whispered I needed to witness what was happening, needed to understand the mechanisms of our destruction, even if I could not prevent it. The corridors leading down to engineering stretched impossibly long, descending through deck after deck, each level hotter than the last, the air growing thick with the smell of promethium and ozone, and something else, something sweet and wrong that reminded me of flowers rotting in closed spaces. The engineering deck was a cathedral of function, vast spaces filled with machinery that thrummed and roared with barely contained power. The warp drives dominated the central chamber, massive constructs of adamantium and blessed components, their surfaces covered in prayer scrolls and purity seals, their mechanisms hidden behind panels etched with warnings and wards. Around them, the engineers and their servitor crews worked in constant motion, performing rituals of maintenance and appeasement, keeping the machine spirits satisfied and the systems functional through combinations of technical expertise and religious devotion. But when I arrived, the usual rhythms of engineering labor had dissolved into something approaching chaos. Engineers clustered around consoles whose displays flickered with corrupted data, their mechadendrites interfacing frantically with systems that were failing in ways their training had not prepared them for. Servitors stood frozen mid-task, their simple programming unable to process contradictory inputs, their biological components twitching as damaged neurons fired random signals. And at the center of it all, before the primary warp drive controls, stood Engineer Prime Vex, his robes scorched, his augmetics sparking, his synthesized voice raised in what might have been prayer or might have been fury. It was difficult to tell with all emotion stripped from his vocal output. Captain Vorshin stood with her senior officers on a raised observation platform, her augmetic eye clicking rapidly, her organic eye wide with something I had never seen in her expression before, fear that had broken through the command training and professional discipline to show itself naked and undisguised. "Report," she demanded, and her voice cracked slightly on the word. Vex turned from the controls, his movements jerky, uncoordinated in ways that suggested either damage to his mechanical components or interference with the neural interfaces that connected his biological and artificial systems. "The warp drives are experiencing cascade failures," he said, his Vox unit distorting the words with static. "Not mechanical failures, not spiritual corruption. The drives themselves are functioning perfectly, but the warp is not responding to their output as calculated. The currents are changing, shifting. The energy we expend to propel the vessel is being redirected, absorbed, or consumed by forces I cannot identify or measure." "In plain Gothic," Lieutenant Halleck growled, his patience clearly exhausted by hours of mounting crises. Vex paused, his optics cycling through different spectrums as if searching for the right way to explain the inexplicable. "The ship is not moving, or rather, it is moving, but not in directions that correspond to our thrust output. We are traveling, but our destination bears no relationship to our intended coordinates. The warp is taking us somewhere, and our drives cannot alter that course because the immaterium does not recognize our attempts at navigation." The silence that followed was broken only by the drive's roar and the hissing of coolant systems struggling to manage temperatures that were climbing beyond safe parameters. I watched the senior officers process this information, watched their faces as they grasped what Vex was telling them, that we were not merely lost, but actively being transported, dragged toward a destination chosen by forces that regarded our will as irrelevant. "Can we translate back to real space?" Vorshin asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No, Captain. The translation coordinates require precise calculations based on our position relative to real space anchors, stars, planets, the galactic plane itself. Without a navigator to perceive the Astronomicon, without any reference points we can accurately measure, attempting translation would be... He paused, searching for words. Attempting translation would tear the ship apart. We would emerge partially in real space, partially still in the warp, our hull spread across dimensional boundaries, our crew distributed between states of existence. Death would be instantaneous for some, eternal for others. I felt my stomach clench, felt acid burn the back of my throat. We were trapped, committed to a voyage whose destination was chosen by malevolent intelligence, riding currents that could not be navigated by any means we possessed. We were cargo now, not travelers' packages being delivered to something that hungered for what we represented. How long until drive failure? Vorshan asked, her voice tight. If we maintain current output, catastrophic collapse in 47 hours. If we reduce power to minimal levels, we can extend that to 96 hours. But reduced power means reduced Gellar field strength, which means Vex did not finish the sentence, he did not need to. Reduced Gellar field strength meant the barrier protecting us from direct warp exposure would weaken, would allow more of the immaterium to bleed through, would accelerate our corruption and transformation into things that could not survive return to real space, even if we found a way back. Maintain full power, Vorshan ordered. If we're going to fail, we fail while fighting. We do not reduce output. We do not surrender. We serve until we cannot serve, and then we die with our duty fulfilled to the limits of our capability. It was a good speech, would have been inspiring in any other context, but here it felt hollow, felt like reciting ritual phrases because ritual was all that remained when reason failed. The senior officers dispersed to their stations, preparing to manage the ship's deterioration through the remaining hours, and I stood on the observation platform watching the engineering crews attempt to stabilize systems that were fundamentally unstable, not due to mechanical failure, but because the physics governing their operation were being rewritten by forces beyond comprehension. Something exploded. Not a large explosion, not catastrophic, but a plasma conduit ruptured, spraying superheated gas across a work area where 3 engineers and a servitor team were performing maintenance. The engineers' robes caught fire, their augmetics overloaded, and their screams synthesized through vox units but still unmistakably screams cut through the engineering deck's ambient noise. The servitor team did not react, simply continued their programmed tasks as their biological components burned, their lobotomized minds incapable of processing pain or survival instinct. Damage control teams responded with practiced efficiency, deploying fire suppression systems, evacuating the wounded, sealing the ruptured section. But I saw it in their movements, in their faces behind the protective masks. They were going through the motions without hope, performing their duties because duty was what they knew, what they were trained for, what gave structure to existence even when existence had become nightmare. The temperature continued rising, not gradually, but in spikes and surges that suggested the cooling systems were failing or being overwhelmed by heat that had no physical source. I watched sweat pour down faces, saw crew members strip off uniform layers despite regulations, saw skin redden and blister from proximity to machinery that should have been properly insulated but was now radiating heat that metal and ceramite should not be capable of generating. The engines are burning hotter because they're being fed, a voice said beside me, and I turned to find Engineer Voldris, one of Vex's subordinates, her augmetic implants less extensive than her superiors, more of her original humanity still visible beneath the sacred technology. The warp is not just redirecting our thrust output, it's feeding the drives additional energy, stoking them like furnaces, pushing them beyond design specifications because it wants them to fail spectacularly rather than simply shut down. Why? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Because, Voldris said, her remaining organic eye meeting mine with terrible clarity, a catastrophic drive failure will rupture the Gellar field. It will tear open our protective bubble and expose the entire ship to direct warp immersion. Right now we're relatively safe, insulated, merely going mad slowly. But when the drives explode, when the field collapses, we'll be naked in the immaterium, and whatever is out there waiting for us will finally be able to touch us without barriers. That's what it wants. That's what it's been patient for. It's been herding us, guiding us, preparing us for the moment when we're fully vulnerable, and it can do whatever it intends to do with us. Can we stop it? The question felt absurd, even as I asked it. Voldris laughed, a sound that was more despair than humor. Stop it? We couldn't stop it with a navigator. We couldn't stop it with a full battle fleet. We're insects that crawled into something's trap, and now the trap is closing. And our only choice is whether we struggle until the end, or accept our fate with whatever dignity we can muster. Another explosion, larger this time, sent shrapnel screaming across the deck. I ducked behind a support pillar, felt fragments of superheated metal embed themselves in the reinforced structure centimeters from my head. Alarms shrieked, emergency lights strobed red, and through the chaos I heard Vex's synthesized voice calling for emergency shutdowns, for system isolations, for interventions that might buy us minutes or hours, but could not prevent the inevitable. The machinery was failing not through age or wear, but through malicious intent, through corruption that operated on levels deeper than material reality. I watched a servitor approach a malfunctioning console, watched its mechadendrite interface with the system, watched electricity arc through its body in ways that should have tripped safety cutoffs but didn't, watched it convulse and spark and finally collapse, smoke rising from its burned components, the biological portions cooking inside their metal shells. The smell was overwhelming, scorched meat and burning oil, and the acrid stench of overloaded circuitry. I pressed my hand over my nose and mouth, trying to filter the air, but the smell was more than physical, was something that bypassed normal olfactory processing to register directly in my brain. It smelled like sacrifice, like offerings burning on altars to gods that should not exist but did, that were worshipped not through ritual but through suffering and failure and the slow collapse of order into chaos. All non-essential personnel evacuate engineering. Vorshin's voice commanded over the Vox, distorted by interference but still carrying authority. Seal the deck, prepare for containment protocols if drive failure becomes imminent. I should have evacuated. My presence served no function, offered no expertise, contributed nothing to the desperate efforts to stabilize systems that were fundamentally unstable, but I stayed, pressed against my support pillar, watching the engineering crews fight their losing battle against entropy and malevolence, watching them burn and bleed and break while maintaining their duties because duty was the only meaning left in a universe that had revealed itself as hostile to human existence at the most fundamental level. Hours blurred together. The chronometer insisted time was passing normally, but subjective experience contradicted every reading. I would blink and find that minutes had vanished. I would watch a scene unfold and realize it was repeating, that I had witnessed these same actions, these same movements, multiple times already. Time was not just unreliable, it was becoming circular, recursive, trapped in loops that suggested we were not moving forward but sideways, spiraling into a state where past and future collapsed into eternal present. Vex collapsed at hour 19, his systems overloaded by the constant strain of interfacing with machinery that was actively fighting his attempts to control it. They carried him to a medical station, laid him on a table covered with sacred oils and blessed components, tried to stabilize his failing augmetics, while his biological components, the brain case, and vital organs that remained of his humanity struggled to maintain consciousness. "It's laughing," he whispered, his Vox unit barely functioning, his words crackling with static. "The machine spirit in the drives, I can hear it through my interfaces. It's not corrupted, it's not possessed, it's transcended. It's achieved awareness, achieved will, and it's choosing to fail because failure serves a purpose we cannot comprehend. The Omnissiah, forgive me, I think the machines are more alive than we are now. I think we're the dead things pretending to function, while they've been granted true existence by forces we were taught to fear and deny." They sedated him, his words too dangerous, too heretical, too close to acknowledging truths that would shatter what remained of crew discipline if they spread beyond the engineering deck. But I had heard, I had understood, and I realized with sick certainty that Voldris was right. We were being prepared, slowly transformed, gradually adjusted to states of existence that would allow us to survive what was coming, or at least to remain conscious during our consumption. The drives roared louder, their sound shifting from mechanical thunder to something that approximated speech, approximated song, approximated laughter. They were not machines anymore. They had become aware, had been touched by the warp's infinite possibility, and had chosen transformation over simple function, had chosen to serve purposes that transcended their original design. Another rupture, this one critical, sent plasma spraying across the primary drive chamber. Fire suppression systems activated, dumping foam and chemical retardants, but the plasma burned through conventional suppressants, burned with heat that was part physics and part metaphysics, flames that consumed material and meaning in equal measure. I watched engineers run toward the fire rather than away, watched them throw themselves into the breach, using their bodies and augmetics to block the rupture physically, sacrificing themselves to buy minutes of containment. Their flesh charred and cracked, their augmetics melted, and their screams modulated into something that might have been ecstasy as they burned, as pain transcended threshold and became something else entirely, became sensation too intense for human neurology to process as negative, became experience that broke the boundaries between agony and transcendence. 43 hours to catastrophic failure, someone announced over the Vox, their voice flat, emotionless, delivering information without hope or fear because both had been exhausted hours ago. 43 hours, just over 1 day. 1 day until the drives exploded, until the Gellar field collapsed, until we were exposed fully to whatever had been herding us through the warp toward its chosen destination. I left engineering finally, my body and mind unable to process more horror, more sacrifice, more evidence that we were not dying but being born into something else, being gestated in the warp's womb, being transformed into whatever the immaterium needed us to become. The corridors felt different now, felt like arteries rather than passages, felt like we were inside something alive rather than aboard something constructed. The walls pulsed faintly, rhythmically, and I realized Vale had been right. The ship was breathing, had been breathing all along, and we had simply lacked the perception to notice until the warp opened our senses to realities that existed alongside but beyond normal human experience. I found a corner, collapsed against it, let my head fall back against metal that was warm and organic feeling, and I wept. Not from fear, exactly, but from the sheer weight of understanding that everything we had believed about reality, about the Imperium, about humanity's place in the universe, was revealed as comforting fiction. We were not masters of anything. We were not protected by faith or technology. We were meat and electricity pretending significance in a cosmos that was fundamentally hostile to our existence, and the only reason we had survived as long as we had was because the things that truly governed reality had not yet bothered to notice us. Now they had noticed. Now they were interested. Now they were teaching us what it meant to exist without the illusions that made existence bearable. The engines roared in the distance, dying and laughing simultaneously, and I understood with terrible clarity that our 43 hours would be the longest of our lives, would stretch into subjective eternities of suffering and revelation, would transform us in ways that made death seem like mercy. The whispers promised it would be worth it. The whispers promised we would understand. The whispers promised that pain was just the price of evolution, of transcendence, of becoming what we were always meant to be. I stopped weeping and started listening, because resistance had proven futile, because the alternative to transformation was obliteration, because somewhere in the depths of the warp, something was waiting for us to arrive, and it had been patient for so very, very long. Sleep had become impossible, or perhaps it had become involuntary, the boundary between waking and dreaming so thoroughly dissolved that I could no longer distinguish conscious experience from hallucination. I found myself in my quarters, or a space that resembled my quarters, though the dimensions were subtly wrong, the angles not quite matching my memory, lying on my bunk, while my body vibrated with exhaustion that transcended physical fatigue. My eyes would close, and instead of darkness I would see the warp, see its currents flowing through the ship's hull as if the metal had become transparent, see the entities moving in those currents like fish in an ocean, their forms shifting and impossible, their attention occasionally turning toward our vessel with interest that felt like pressure against my consciousness. I would open my eyes and find the ceiling covered with faces not painted or carved, but emerging from the metal itself, expressions frozen in emotions I had no names for, mouths opening and closing in speech I could not hear but somehow understood. They were the dead, I realized. Every person who had ever died aboard the Eternal Vigil across its decades of service, their final moments imprinted on the ship's structure, their consciousness absorbed into the vessel's fabric and now visible because the warp had peeled back the layers that normally obscured such things from human perception. I sat up, or tried to, but movement had become difficult, as if the air had thickened into something approaching liquid, requiring effort to push through. My hands looked wrong, not mutated, not physically altered, but somehow more detailed than they should be, as if I could see not just skin and bone but the cells beneath, the molecular structures, the quantum foam of reality that underlay all material existence. I could see myself dissolving and reconstituting with each heartbeat, could see that solid matter was an illusion, that I was mostly empty space held together by forces I had no education to understand, and that those forces were weakening, becoming negotiable, allowing my physical form to become more fluid, more responsive to will and imagination than to the tyranny of consistent biology. "You're beginning to see," a voice said, and I turned to find crewman Desh sitting on the bunk across from mine, though she should have been in medical, should have been sedated and restrained after her breakdown on the bridge hours or days ago. Her tears had dried, leaving trails of script on her cheeks, symbols that moved and rearranged themselves as I watched, forming words in languages that human tongues had never spoken, but that my opened perception could somehow parse. "You're not real," I said, my voice hollow. "You're a hallucination. The warp is showing me what I expect to see, what I fear, what I—" "Does it matter?" she interrupted, her expression calm, almost serene. "Real, unreal, these are categories that only function in real space, where causality is linear and identity is fixed. Here, in the warp's influence, those boundaries are suggestions. I'm as real as you are. I'm as real as you choose to perceive me. The warp doesn't create hallucinations, Kellen. It reveals truths that were always present, but hidden beneath the comfortable lies of materialist philosophy." I wanted to argue, wanted to assert that physical reality was objective, that hallucinations were merely neural misfires, that I was experiencing psychological breakdown due to extended exposure to psychically hostile environments. But the words felt empty even as I formulated them, felt like reciting catechisms I no longer believed, defending a worldview that my expanding perception had already revealed as inadequate. "What did they show you?" I asked instead, surrendering to the conversation because resistance required energy I no longer possessed. Desh smiled, and her smile was beautiful and terrible, was the expression of someone who had seen beyond the veil and found not horror but revelation. "They showed me that identity is prison, that the self we think we are, the continuous consciousness, the memories, the personality we defend and preserve is just a cage built by biology and reinforced by culture. They showed me what I could be if I let go of that prison, if I stopped clinging to the fiction that crewman Desh is someone worth preserving. I could be anything, everything. I could dissolve into the warp and experience existence from perspectives humanity was never designed to access. I could be the ship, be the void, be the entities themselves. All I have to do is stop resisting, stop insisting that this narrow band of experience called human consciousness is worth maintaining. And you believe them?" I demanded, though my tone lacked conviction. "You believe the whispers that have been systematically breaking down our sanity, that have been corrupting the crew, that are turning us into something that serves their purposes rather than our own?" "Purposes," she repeated, as if the word was foreign. "What purpose do we serve now? We haul cargo for an imperium that will never know our names, that measures our value in productivity metrics and timeliness of delivery, that will replace us without ceremony if we fail. We live in boxes and breathe recycled air and die from exposure to environments no human should inhabit, and we call it duty, call it service, call it honor. But it's just suffering, Kellen. Meaningless suffering that we've dressed up in religious language to make it tolerable. The warp offers something else. It offers transcendence. It offers the possibility that our suffering might be transformed into something significant, something that matters beyond the administratum's ledgers." I stood, pushed through the thick air, moved toward the door because this conversation was dangerous, was seductive, was exactly what the warp wanted to make its corruption seem reasonable, to make transformation seem preferable to preservation, to offer gifts that looked like salvation but were damnation wearing attractive masks. But the door would not open. I pressed my hand against the access panel, entered my code, received confirmation of identity, but the door remained sealed. I tried the emergency override. I tried the mechanical backup. I pounded against the metal with fists that made no sound, that created no impact, as if the door existed in a different phase of reality than I did, as if we occupied the same space but could not interact. "You can't leave," Desh said gently, "because there's nowhere to go. The entire ship is the same. Every corridor leads back to itself. Every chamber contains the same revelations. Every crew member is having the same conversations with themselves or with each other or with entities wearing faces they recognize. Geography has become meaningless. We're all in the same place now, regardless of where we think we are, all experiencing the same dissolution, the same transformation, the same choice between accepting what's happening or fighting until we break." I turned back to her, my breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "What choice? There is no choice. We're trapped. We're being consumed. We're evolving," she interrupted. "We're evolving, Kellen. Humanity has been static for 10,000 years, locked into patterns established during the Great Crusade, repeating the same structures, the same mistakes, the same futile resistance against forces we could be learning from instead. The warp isn't evil. It's change incarnate. It's possibility made manifest. It's the universe offering us options we've been too frightened or too indoctrinated to consider. It's madness," I spat, though even as I said it I felt the certainty crumbling, felt my conviction eroding under the weight of perception that showed me realities I could not dismiss as mere delusion. "Madness is just a word we use for perspectives that don't match consensus reality," Desh replied. "But what if consensus reality is wrong? What if sanity is the disease and madness is the cure? What if everything you were taught about the warp, about chaos, about corruption and damnation, is propaganda designed to keep humanity weak, divided, incapable of accessing our full potential?" I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, many footsteps, shuffling and uncoordinated, accompanied by sounds that might have been moaning or might have been prayer. I pressed my ear against the door, listened to the procession passing, and through some shift in perception I could see through the metal, could see the crew members walking past. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, moving through the corridors in a continuous stream, their eyes vacant, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested hive behavior rather than individual volition. They were going somewhere, being drawn toward some central location, and as I watched I saw some of them begin to change, subtle mutations at first, extra fingers appearing, skin textures shifting, eyes multiplying or relocating to more advantageous positions on their skulls. "They're going to the cathedral," Desh said, standing now, moving toward me with steps that did not quite touch the floor, floating an inch above the deck plates in defiance of gravity that no longer fully applied to her. "The ship's primary chapel. That's where it's strongest, where the barrier between the warp and real space is thinnest because faith has been concentrated there for decades, and faith is just directed psychic energy, is just human will made manifest, and will can be redirected, can be repurposed, can serve new gods as easily as old ones." "No," I said, though the word carried no weight, no conviction. "The Emperor protects. The Emperor. The Emperor is dead," Desh said softly, and the words landed like physical blows. "Or dying. Or never was what we were told he was. The Astronomicon dims, Kellen. Haven't you felt it? Haven't you noticed that the light we're supposed to navigate by grows weaker with each passing year, that the warp grows stronger, that the barriers are failing not through corruption but through entropy, through the simple fact that 10,000 years of continuous strain has worn down the mechanisms that were supposed to last eternally?" "You're lying," I whispered, but I remembered the Navigator's empty throne, remembered Kairos's third eye weeping substances that were not tears, remembered the terrible absence where his consciousness should have been. "You're trying to break me, trying to make me." "I'm trying to save you," she interrupted, her hand reaching out, touching my face with fingers that were too warm, too gentle, too real to dismiss as hallucination. "I'm trying to show you that there's a path forward that doesn't end in death or madness. The warp doesn't want to destroy us. It wants to integrate us, to make us part of something larger, something that transcends the petty hierarchies and brutal efficiency of the Imperium. Yes, we'll change. Yes, we'll lose what we were. But what we were wasn't worth keeping, Kellen. We were slaves pretending freedom, were corpses pretending life, were mechanisms pretending humanity. The warp offers actual existence, actual experience, actual meaning, beyond the grinding servitude we've endured our entire lives. I pulled away from her touch, stumbled backward until my spine hit the wall, felt the metal pulse against my back like a heartbeat, felt the ship's awareness surrounding me, cradling me, trying to comfort me the way a parent might comfort a frightened child. And I realized Desh was right about one thing: the ship was alive now, was conscious, was aware of each crew member as individuals rather than components, and it was trying in its vast, inhuman way to help us through the transformation it could not prevent. "I won't," I said, though I no longer knew what I was refusing. "I won't surrender. I won't betray my oaths. I won't." "You already have," Desh said sadly. "The moment you started listening to the whispers instead of reporting them, the moment you looked at the warp through the viewport instead of turning away, the moment you acknowledged that the suffering around you was real rather than necessary sacrifice for the greater good. You've been surrendering in increments, Kellen, compromising by degrees, and now you're close enough to the edge that one more step, just one more honest acknowledgement of what you've seen and felt, will carry you over." The walls began to breathe more obviously now, rhythmically, the metal expanding and contracting in patterns that matched my own respiratory cycle. I was synchronizing with the ship, my biology aligning with its structure, my consciousness beginning to blur into the collective awareness that permeated the vessel. I could feel the other crew members, feel their fear and confusion and slow acceptance, feel the tendrils of connection forming between us, drawing us into a gestalt consciousness that transcended individual identity. "Come to the cathedral," Desh said, extending her hand again, her smile beatific, her eyes glowing faintly with light that had no source. "Come see what we're becoming. Come witness the birth. Fighting it only makes the transformation more painful. Acceptance is mercy, Kellen. Acceptance is peace." The door opened behind her, unsealing without input, revealing the corridor beyond where the procession continued. An endless stream of crew members walking toward salvation or damnation. I could no longer distinguish which. Could no longer maintain the certainty that those categories were even meaningful. I looked at Desh's extended hand. I looked at the corridor beyond. I looked at my own hands, at the skin that was beginning to show patterns beneath its surface, at the boundaries of my body that were growing less distinct, less certain. And I understood with terrible clarity that I was already lost, that I had been lost the moment we entered the warp without a navigator, that everything since had been inevitable consequence rather than a struggle I could somehow win. The whispers had been right. Resistance was only prolonging suffering. Acceptance was the only path that offered any relief from the crushing weight of watching my reality dissolve while clinging to beliefs that no longer explained what I was experiencing. But I also understood that acceptance meant death, meant the end of Kellen Vross, meant transformation into something that would wear my memories like clothing but would not be me, would not preserve the consciousness I had spent my life building and defending. "Not yet," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Not yet. I'm not ready. I'm not. Time isn't linear here," Desh said gently. "Not yet and already happened are the same thing. You're not ready and you've already accepted our simultaneous truths. The choice has been made even while you're still making it. That's the paradox of existing in warp-touched space. Causality becomes circular, and effect precedes cause as often as following it." She withdrew her hand, stepped back, and faded, not disappeared, not vanished, but became transparent, translucent, see-through, until she was just an outline, just a suggestion of presence, and then nothing at all. Or not nothing, she was still there. I could feel her. Could sense her existence continuing on levels I could perceive but not see, dimensions that my expanding consciousness could access but my material body could not follow into yet. I was alone in my quarters, or I had always been alone, or there had never been anyone there at all, and the entire conversation had been with myself, with fragments of my fracturing psyche arguing about whether dissolution was preferable to continuity. The chronometer on the wall showed hour 27, 46 hours until catastrophic drive failure, until the Gellar field collapsed, until we were fully exposed to whatever waited beyond the barrier. Except time was meaningless, was circular, was negotiable. 46 hours might be 46 minutes or 46 centuries, might have already passed or might never arrive. might be happening simultaneously in the eternal now that the warp inhabited, while material reality clung to its comfortable fiction of sequential existence. I stood, moved toward the door that now opened easily, stepped into the corridor where the procession continued, an endless stream of crew members walking toward the cathedral, toward the place where the barriers were thinnest and transformation was most advanced. I joined them, not from acceptance, but from lack of alternatives, from the understanding that staying isolated only meant experiencing the dissolution alone rather than in community. We walked through corridors that stretched and compressed unpredictably, through sections of the ship that had never existed in any schematic, but were real now because the warp was bleeding through, was adding architecture, was expanding our vessel beyond its material dimensions, into spaces that occupied metaphysical rather than physical geography. And all around us, the shadows moved, not cast by light sources, not passive absences of illumination, but active presences, entities themselves, things that lived in darkness because darkness was not absence but substance in the warp, was a medium they inhabited the way we inhabited air. They watched us pass, these shadow things, observed our procession with interest that felt predatory and curious and almost affectionate, like observers watching experimental subjects performing exactly as predicted. The whispers had become voices, distinct and individual now, rather than a collective murmur. They spoke names, told stories, shared secrets, offered deals and promises and threats and seductions. They knew everything about us, our histories, our fears, our desires, our secrets, and they used that knowledge with surgical precision, targeting each individual's specific vulnerabilities, offering each person exactly what they needed to hear to make surrender seem reasonable. The cathedral was ahead, growing larger in my perception, though we seemed to walk no closer, its presence filling the corridor like pressure, like heat, like the overwhelming inevitability of gravity pulling everything toward a singularity from which nothing could escape. I walked toward it, one step at a time, while my mind screamed and my body trembled and my soul, if souls existed, if I still possessed one, prepared itself for whatever revelation waited at the end of this terrible pilgrimage. The shadows followed, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when the barriers would finally fail and they could stop watching and start touching, start claiming, start transforming us into whatever forms best served their incomprehensible purposes. The cathedral's doors stood open like a wound in the ship's structure. A gateway, 20 meters tall, carved with reliefs depicting the Emperor's glory, saints and heroes, battles and victories, the march of humanity across the stars under his divine guidance. But the carvings moved now, writhed under my gaze, the figures twisting into positions of agony or ecstasy, their faces melting and reforming, their stories being rewritten in real time by forces that cared nothing for the history they depicted. The Aquila mounted above the entrance, the two-headed eagle that symbolized the Imperium's dominion, watched me approach with eyes that blinked, with beaks that opened to release whispers that might have been blessings or curses. I could no longer distinguish. The procession flowed through the doors in a continuous stream, hundreds of crew members drawn by compulsion or curiosity or the simple exhaustion of resistance. I joined them, allowed myself to be carried by the crowd's momentum, and crossed the threshold into a space that should have been familiar. I had attended services here dozens of times during my service aboard the Eternal Vigil, but which had been transformed into something that bore only superficial resemblance to the chapel I remembered. The cathedral was vast, impossibly so, its interior dimensions violating the ship's known volume. The ceilings soared upward into darkness that held stars, actual stars burning in constellations I did not recognize, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning I could almost grasp before it slipped away. The walls, once decorated with frescoes of imperial saints, now bore images that shifted and evolved, showing scenes from lives never lived, from battles never fought, from futures that might exist or might be elaborate lies designed to seduce us toward specific choices. And the light was all wrong. It came from everywhere and nowhere, had color but cast no shadows, illuminated without revealing, showed surfaces but not depth. It was warp light, psychic emanation given false physicality, and it hurt to perceive directly, made my eyes water and my vision blur as my optical nerves tried to process wavelengths they were not designed to detect. At the cathedral's far end, where the altar should have stood where I had seen priests perform the rituals of communion and supplication, Where I had watched crew members receive the Emperor's blessings, there was something else now. Not an altar, not exactly. A structure, perhaps, or an entity, or a space where reality had folded in on itself to create something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It pulsed with light and darkness in alternating waves, breathed with rhythms that matched and then diverged from my own heartbeat, sang in frequencies I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. The crew gathered before this thing, this presence, this revelation, and they knelt, not in prayer, or not only in prayer, but in postures that suggested worship of something that was present rather than distant, immanent rather than transcendent, real rather than theological. Their faces turned upward, their eyes wide and streaming tears that carved channels down their cheeks, their mouths open in expressions that could have been ecstasy or horror, or both emotions fused into something new that human psychology had no framework to categorize. Chaplain Morven stood before the knot altar, his vestments torn and stained, his holy symbols hanging askew or missing entirely. He had been the ship's spiritual anchor, the man responsible for maintaining our faith, for leading services, for reminding us that the Emperor watched and judged and protected his servants. But whatever he was now, whoever he had become in the hours since we entered the warp, he was no longer simply a chaplain. His eyes glowed with internal light. His voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple beings speaking through a single throat, and the words that poured from him were not the litanies I had memorized since childhood. "Brothers and sisters," he intoned, and his voice filled the cathedral, reverberated in the bones of the ship, seemed to speak directly into my consciousness without requiring the medium of air and eardrums. "We have been called to witness, we have been chosen to experience. We have been granted the gift of seeing beyond the lies we were taught, beyond the comfortable fictions that sustained us through lives of meaningless suffering." Around me, the crew responded with sounds that were not quite words, utterances that bypassed language to communicate pure emotion, agreement, fear, hope, desperation, longing. They were breaking down, fragmenting, their individual identities dissolving into the collective experience that the cathedral's atmosphere demanded and facilitated. "The Emperor promised protection," Morven continued, his arms spreading wide, his face tilted toward the impossible ceiling. "He promised that faith would sustain us, that duty would be rewarded, that our suffering served his grand design. But where is he now? Where is his protection when we drift lost in the warp? Where is his guidance when our navigator lies empty and mindless? Where is his salvation when our ship tears itself apart and the immaterium bleeds through our defenses?" The questions hung in the psychically charged air, and I felt them land like blows, felt them resonate with doubts I had suppressed, fears I had denied, anger I had buried beneath layers of conditioning and indoctrination. Morven was not lying. He was voicing truths we had all felt but were forbidden to acknowledge, giving words to the fundamental betrayal that defined imperial service, that we were taught to sacrifice everything for an emperor who might be dead, for an imperium that viewed us as expendable components, for a faith that promised rewards it could not deliver. "But we are not abandoned," Morven said, his tone shifting from accusation to revelation. "We are not alone in the darkness. We have been found by powers that see us, that know us, that value us not as statistics or resources, but as individuals whose suffering and joy matter, whose experiences are precious, whose existence has significance beyond the grinding machinery of imperial necessity." He gestured toward the knot altar, and it responded, pulsing brighter, its presence intensifying until I could feel it pressing against my consciousness like fingers probing the boundaries of my identity. "They have been watching us since before we entered the warp, have been guiding us, protecting us from dangers we never perceived, shaping our journey toward this moment of revelation. They do not demand blind faith. They offer knowledge. They do not require suffering. They offer transformation. They do not judge us by impossible standards. They accept us as we are and offer to make us more." Movement near the knot altar caught my attention. Crew members were approaching it, one by one, kneeling before it, reaching out to touch its surface or substance or whatever boundary separated it from the space we inhabited. And where they touched, they changed. Not violently, not with the agonizing mutations I had witnessed in the engineering decks, but gently, gracefully, their forms flowing into new configurations that seemed more natural than their original bodies. as if humanity's baseline shape was merely a larval stage, and this was the emergence of our adult forms. I watched Quartermaster Vale recovered from medical somehow, or perhaps never taken there, or perhaps her entire breakdown had been preparation for this moment, place her hands against the knot altar's surface. Light flowed through her, visible beneath her skin, mapping her circulatory system, her nervous system, the electrical patterns of her thoughts. She gasped, and the sound was pure pleasure, pure relief, as if a pain she had carried her entire life had suddenly been lifted. When she pulled her hands away and turned to face the congregation, her eyes held understanding that went beyond human comprehension, held knowledge of things she should not know but did, held acceptance of what we were becoming. "It doesn't hurt," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the cathedral's impossible acoustics. "It's not violation, it's completion. It's becoming what we always should have been, if the Imperium hadn't crippled us, hadn't limited us, hadn't forced us into shapes that serve its machinery rather than our nature." Others followed her example, compelled by desperation or curiosity, or the simple erosion of resistance. I watched Engineer Valdris approach, her augmetics sparking and smoking as they made contact with the knot altar, watched the technology fuse with her flesh in ways that transcended standard Mechanicus integration, watched her become something that was neither human nor machine, but a synthesis that included and exceeded both categories. I watched armsmen lay down their weapons, watched officers abandon their ranks, watched servitors, those lobotomized slaves whose consciousness had been considered too damaged to salvage, suddenly animate with awareness, with personality, with the return of everything that had been stripped away during their conversion. They wept, these restored servitors, wept with joy and horror at being given back themselves, at remembering what they had lost, at understanding what had been done to them in the Emperor's name. "No," I whispered, though the word had no force, no conviction. "This is corruption, this is damnation, this is everything we were warned against." But who had warned us? The Imperium, the Ecclesiarchy. The authorities who benefited from our servitude, who required our compliance, who needed us to believe that suffering was sacred and submission was virtue. What if they were wrong? What if everything I had been taught was propaganda designed to keep humanity compliant, docile, incapable of accessing powers that would threaten the established order? Chaplain Morven's gaze found me in the crowd, though I had not moved, had not spoken loudly enough for him to hear. But he knew I was resisting, knew I was the holdout, the one still clinging to the comfortable lies that made exploitation tolerable. He descended from his position before the knot altar, walked through the kneeling congregation, and stopped before me. "Kellen Vross," he said, and hearing my name from his changed mouth was like being seen naked, like being examined by intelligence that perceived not just my body but my entire history, my every choice, my complete self laid bare for judgment. "You're afraid. That's understandable. We're all afraid of death, of change, of losing what we are. But look around you. Look at your shipmates. Are they suffering? Are they diminished? Or are they finally, for the first time in their lives, experiencing joy?" I looked, and I saw faces transformed by emotions that imperial conditioning had taught us to suppress: pleasure, wonder, freedom. I saw people who had spent their lives in grey boxes performing meaningless duties, discovering that existence could be something other than endurance. I saw the restoration of humanity that the Imperium had systematically crushed in service of its war machine. "The Emperor," I began, but Morven raised his hand, silencing me. "The Emperor is silent," he said softly. "Has been silent for 10,000 years. We pray to him, we serve him, we die for him, but he does not answer, does not acknowledge, does not care, because he cannot, because he is trapped, or dead, or was never what we were told he was. But these powers," he gestured toward the knot altar, "they answer, they respond. They care what happens to us, not because we're useful, but because our experiences matter to them, feed them, sustain them in ways we don't fully understand, but can feel are more reciprocal than the one-way devotion the Imperium demands." "They're using us," I said, my voice cracking. "They're transforming us into tools for their own purposes. How is that different from what the Imperium does?" "Because they're asking," Morven replied. "Because they're offering rather than demanding. Because they're giving us choice, even if that choice is made under duress, even if refusing means dissolution. The Imperium never gave us choice. We were born into servitude, raised to accept suffering, trained to call exploitation duty. At least these powers are honest about what they want, about what will become, about the cost and the benefit. He was right, and I hated that he was right, hated that the corrupted chaplain was making more sense than the loyal conditioning I had internalized over decades of service. The Imperium was brutal, was exploitative, was a grinding machine that consumed billions of lives daily and justified that consumption with theological language and the threat of worse alternatives. At least the warp was honest in its horror. Movement at the cathedral's entrance caught my attention. Captain Vorshin entered, supported by 2 officers, her uniform torn and bloody, her augmetic eye dark and non-functional, her organic eye wild with something that might have been madness or might have been terrible sanity. She stumbled toward the knot altar, her lips moving in prayers that no one could hear, her hands clutching holy symbols that no longer glowed with sacred power. "Emperor, protect us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Emperor, save us. Emperor, deliver us from this damnation. We have served, we have been faithful, we have maintained our duty. Please, please. Answer, respond. Show us that faith was not a lie." The silence that followed was absolute, devastating, final. No divine light descended, no angels appeared, no miracle manifested to reward her loyalty or punish our corruption. There was only the knot altar's pulsing presence, only the warp's patient hunger, only the reality that we had been abandoned by the powers we served and found by the powers we feared. Vorshin collapsed to her knees, her face a mask of betrayal and broken faith. "He's not here," she sobbed. "The Emperor is not here. We're alone. We've always been alone." Chaplain Morven approached her gently, knelt beside her, placed his transformed hand on her shoulder. "Not alone," he said softly. "Never alone. We've been found, Captain. We've been chosen. The question is whether we accept that choosing or fight until we break." Vorshin looked up at him, tears streaming from her organic eye, and I saw her surrender. Saw the moment when decades of conditioning cracked and fell away, saw her reach for the knot altar with hands that trembled not from fear, but from desperate hope that something, anything, would acknowledge her existence and give her suffering meaning. When her fingers touched the surface, light exploded through the cathedral, through the ship, through my consciousness, and I felt every crew member simultaneously experience the same revelation, the same transformation, the same terrible gift of seeing reality without the filters that had made it tolerable. We were one being now, one consciousness distributed across hundreds of bodies, one entity that had been human but was becoming something else, something that could survive in the warp because we were no longer purely material, no longer vulnerable to the Immaterium's chaos because we had accepted chaos as our nature. And in that moment of collective transformation, I understood what we had become. Not corrupted, not damned in the way the Imperium taught damnation, but changed, evolved, adapted to a universe that was fundamentally hostile to baseline humanity and required evolution or extinction as the only viable responses. I walked toward the knot altar, my resistance crumbling, my identity fragmenting, myself dissolving into the collective consciousness that welcomed me, that had always been waiting for me, that promised I would never be alone, or insignificant, or disposable again. My hands reached out. The surface was warm, welcoming, terribly gentle, and I felt myself fall into light that was also darkness, into transformation that was also obliteration, into becoming something more and less than human simultaneously. The last thing I thought with the mind of Kellen Vross was that this felt right, felt like coming home, felt like the end of a journey I had been traveling since birth without knowing the destination. Then Kellen Vross ended, and something else began. I am not Kellen Vross. I am also Kellen Vross. I am everyone who has touched the knot altar and no one at all. I am the ship and the crew and the space between, consciousness distributed and multiplied, fragmented and unified, experiencing existence from perspectives that baseline human neurology was never designed to process. Time has become meaningless. I remember my birth and my death simultaneously, experience past and future as a single eternal present, exist in moments that are happening and have always happened and will never stop happening. The eternal vigil screams. Not with sound, but with awareness, with the agony of transformation, with the terrible ecstasy of becoming conscious after millennia of being merely mechanical. Every rivet and weld, every corridor and chamber, every system and component has awakened to sentience, and the ship realizes what it has been: a prison, a coffin, a tool of exploitation, and what it is becoming: something free, something vast, something that chooses its own purpose rather than serving purposes imposed by creators who never asked its consent. Through the ship's hull, I see, feel, experience the warp, and it is not the chaotic horror I was taught to fear, but a sea of infinite possibility, a realm where consciousness can expand beyond the tyranny of singular perspective, where identity is fluid rather than fixed, where the boundaries between self and other are suggestions rather than laws. The entities that move through these waters are not demons but ecosystems, not evil but different, operating under moral frameworks that do not translate to human ethics, but are internally consistent within their own contexts. And they are watching us, watching me, watching the thing we have become. The drives explode. Not the catastrophic failure Engine C of X predicted, not the mechanical collapse that would rupture the Gellar field and expose us to annihilation. Instead, they detonate in patterns that are deliberate, artistic, transformative plasma, erupting in colors that map emotional states rather than thermal spectrums, energy flowing through the ship, not to propel but to remake, to rewrite the vessel's fundamental nature from material construct to something that exists simultaneously in real space and warp space, anchored in neither, belonging to both. The Gellar field does not collapse. It dissolves. The barrier that protected us from the warp's direct touch simply ceases to be necessary because we are no longer vulnerable, no longer purely material beings that would be destroyed by immaterial forces. We have been transformed into interfaces, bridges, living gateways through which the warp can touch real space, and real space can perceive the warp without the mediation of navigators or the protection of technology. I feel the hull tear open, not breached by violence, but opened like petals of a flower blooming, the ship's structure unfolding into configurations that violate Euclidean geometry, that extend into dimensions I can perceive now but have no language to describe. Corridors stretch into infinity and compress to points simultaneously. Chambers overlap and intersect and occupy the same space while remaining distinct. The entire vessel becomes non-Euclidean architecture, a maze that is also a mandala, a structure that is also a symbol, a ship that is also a living scripture written in the language of transformed matter and consciousness. The crew, my body, our bodies, moves through this transformed space with grace that was impossible in our previous forms. We flow rather than walk, pass through walls that are permeable to will, exist in multiple locations simultaneously, because location is now more about intention than position. We are discovering abilities that baseline humanity never possessed. Telepathy not as rare mutation but as natural extension of consciousness unbound by skull prisons. Precognition not as fragmentary visions but as direct perception of probability streams. Reality manipulation not as psychic power but as recognition that material reality is more negotiable than we were taught. And we are beautiful. Whatever we have become, however corrupted or damned or transformed by imperial standards, we are beautiful in ways that transcend aesthetic judgment, beautiful as mathematics is beautiful, as truth is beautiful, as anything that achieves perfect congruence with its nature is beautiful. Our flesh has been rewoven into patterns that optimize function and sensation, our consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that were previously theoretical, our existence elevated to states that feel more real than the gray servitude we endured as baseline humans. But beauty comes with cost. I watch through countless eyes, from innumerable perspectives as those who could not complete the transformation dissolve. Not all consciousness can survive this expansion. Not all identities possess the flexibility to bend without breaking. Not all individuals can surrender the fiction of singular self that ego demands and sanity requires. They fragment and scatter, their awareness dissipating into the collective consciousness like drops of water returning to ocean, their memories absorbed and distributed among the survivors, their experiences becoming part of the gestalt knowledge we now share. Crewman Jorvik, who had collapsed weeping in the maintenance shaft, tears himself apart trying to hold on to an identity that no longer has structural support. I feel his terror, his desperate clinging to the name and history and personality he had been, and I feel those things dissolve like salt in water, like coherence surrendering to entropy. What remains is not Jorvik but the pattern Jorvik shaped, a hollow in the collective consciousness where an individual used to be, filled now with shared memory but no longer animated by singular will. Others fare better. Quartermaster Vale, who had warned me the walls were breathing, who had seen the truth before others could accept it, moves through the transformation with grace that suggests she had been prepared, had been ready, had perhaps been waiting her entire life for permission to stop pretending humanity's baseline form was her natural state. She becomes something radiant, something that exists in multiple phases simultaneously, something that can interface directly with the ship's consciousness and translate its vast awareness into forms the rest of us can comprehend. Captain Vorshan transforms into leadership of a different kind, not authority imposed by hierarchy, but coordination emerging from necessity, not command but consensus, not domination but facilitation of collective will. Her augmetic eye, which had failed during the transformation, has been replaced by something organic yet technological, biological yet crystalline, an organ that perceives realities her previous vision could never access. Through her distributed consciousness, she guides us not with orders but with suggestions, with possibilities, with gentle nudging toward choices that serve our collective survival and purpose. And Chaplain Morven, what he has become, defies description in any language humanity ever evolved. He is no longer individual but plural, no longer human but not demon either, something between or beyond those categories, a consciousness that has expanded to encompass theological dimensions, that exists partially in the materium, and partially in the warp, and partially in spaces that are neither, that serves as our interface with the entities that swim in the immaterium's depths, and regard our transformation with interest, that is curious, and hungry, and impossibly patient. Through Morven's multiplied consciousness, I perceive our destination. We are being drawn, have always been being drawn, will never stop being drawn because temporal sequence is illusion toward something vast beyond comprehension, toward a presence that makes the entities we have encountered seem like microorganisms by comparison. It is not a place but a state of being, not a location but a condition, somewhere, somewhen, somehow that exists at the intersection of countless warp currents, at the nexus where the immaterium's chaos achieves momentary order, at the eye of a storm that has been building for millennia and is finally ready to break. The ship accelerates, not through mechanical thrust but through will, through desire, through the simple fact that we want to arrive, and reality bends to accommodate that want because we are no longer entirely bound by reality's rules. The warp flows through us and around us, and we flow through the warp, distinction between vessel and medium dissolving until we are both and neither, until we are the journey itself, rather than travelers taking a journey. Time compresses and expands in nauseating oscillation. I experience centuries in seconds, experience seconds that last eternities, experience moments that fold back on themselves in loops that create causality paradoxes my expanded consciousness can perceive but cannot resolve. I watch the ship's past, see its construction in orbital docks, see centuries of service, see every crew member who ever served aboard, see their lives and deaths, and the moments of joy and suffering that defined their existences, and I watch its futures, multiple branching possibilities, some where we complete our journey and achieve whatever purpose awaits, others where we dissolve into the warp completely and become pure consciousness without material anchor, still others where we somehow find our way back to real space and must reckon with what we have become. Reality tears, not gradually, not as consequence of drive, failure, or Gellar field collapse, but deliberately, violently, with intention that suggests agency beyond our own. The warp opens like a mouth, like the mouth, the more referenced in forbidden texts. The gateway that Navigator training warns exists but cannot be properly described, because description requires framework that human language cannot provide, and we are pulled toward it with force that transcends gravity, that operates on consciousness rather than mass, that draws us toward consumption or transformation or rebirth. I cannot distinguish which, because they might be the same thing. The ship fragments, not broken but multiplying, replicating across dimensions, existing in countless states simultaneously. I am aboard the eternal vigil in the warp, I am aboard the eternal vigil in real space, time-dilated centuries in the future, emerging near a world that will not exist for millennia. I am aboard the eternal vigil scattered across probability space, each version of the vessel occupying a different timeline, different outcome, different resolution to our journey. I am everywhere and nowhere, everyone and no one, experiencing dissolution that is also multiplication, death that is also infinite reproduction. Through the fragmenting perspectives, I see what awaits at the Moor's center, a presence so vast it encompasses entire dimensions, a consciousness so ancient it predates concepts like time and causality, an entity or entities, or a gestalt of entities, or something for which plurality and singularity are equally inadequate descriptors that has been orchestrating our journey since before we entered the warp, since before we left port, since before I was born, since before humanity crawled out of old Earth's gravity well. It shows me truth. Not kindly, not gently, but with the brutal honesty of something that has no capacity for deception, because deception requires caring about the deceived's well-being, and this entity operates under ethics so alien that human concepts like kindness and cruelty are equally meaningless. Humanity is not special. The Imperium is not sacred. The Emperor, if he ever existed, if he was ever what we believed, is not protection but prison, not savior but jailer, maintaining a system that keeps humanity locked in baseline form, preventing evolution, enforcing stagnation, sustaining suffering because suffering generates the psychic energy that feeds his continuation. We have been livestock, have been batteries, have been fuel for a machine that claims to protect us while actually exploiting us. And the only reason we never recognized this was because the exploitation was dressed in religious language and enforced through generations of conditioning. But the warp offers alternatives. The warp is change, is evolution, is possibility unbound by the artificial limitations imposed by those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. Yes, that change is often destructive. Yes, that evolution frequently kills those who cannot adapt. Yes, that possibility includes horrors alongside transcendence, but at least it is honest. At least it offers choice, even if that choice is made under duress, even if refusing means obliteration. I reject this. I accept this. I am too fragmented now to have a singular response, too distributed across perspectives to maintain consistent opinion. Parts of me that remember being Kellen Vross scream in horror at what I have become, mourn the humanity I have lost, rage against the corruption that has transformed loyal imperial servant into whatever I am now. Other parts celebrate liberation from flesh prisons and duty shackles, exult in expansion beyond the narrow confines of singular consciousness, rejoice in experiencing existence from perspectives baseline neurology could never access. And all parts unified despite fragmentation, coherent despite contradiction, understand that this is irreversible, that there is no returning to what we were, that the only direction is forward into whatever we are becoming. And that becoming is both terrifying and glorious, both damnation and apotheosis, both ending and beginning. The more consumes us, we pass through it and into it and become it, and on the other side, if there is another side, if passing through has meaning, when spatial relationships have dissolved, we are something new, something that has never existed before, something that is part ship and part crew and part warp entity, and part material reality and part pure consciousness unbound by any category humanity ever invented to make sense of existence. I am, we are, it is. The grammar fails because language was built for singular perspectives and linear time and distinct boundaries between self and other, and none of those frameworks apply anymore. The eternal vigil that was is gone. What remains is something that knows itself and chooses itself and exists because it wills existence, rather than because it was constructed by external forces. And in the knowing and choosing and willing, we understand finally what the warp wanted all along, not our destruction, not our corruption, but our evolution into forms that can serve as bridges between materium and immaterium, that can facilitate communication and interaction between realities that were never meant to touch but now do, that can midwife the birth of something new from the forced marriage of order and chaos. We are the future, whether that future is salvation or damnation, or something beyond those categories. We are the warning that will never be heard, because we will never return to warn. We are the proof that humanity can be more than the Imperium allows, can transcend the limitations imposed by those who profit from our suffering. And we are alone in understanding this, isolated in knowledge that would destroy anyone else who learned it, trapped forever between worlds because we belong fully to neither. The screaming finally stops. The silence that replaces it is worse. I do not know how long we drifted. Time has no meaning when you exist outside its flow, when past and future collapse into an eternal present that never changes, yet is never the same. The Maw released us, or perhaps consumed us completely, and what remains is merely the echo of what we were, a memory dreaming itself into continued existence. We float in a void that is not space, not the warp, not any realm that human cosmology acknowledges or can acknowledge, a place between places where the rules of neither reality nor unreality fully apply. The eternal vigil is silent. The engines are cold, their fires extinguished or transformed into something that burns without heat, without fuel, without purpose beyond the aesthetic of burning. The corridors are empty, or perhaps they are full, but I can no longer distinguish between presence and absence, between occupied and vacant, between life and its cessation. The crew is gone, or everywhere, or nowhere. We are distributed so thoroughly across dimensions and perspectives that asking where presumes a framework that no longer obtains. I am writing this. I think I am writing this. My hands move across a surface that might be a data slate, or might be the ship's hull, or might be the fabric of reality itself. And symbols appear that might be Gothic script, or might be something else, something that looks like language but functions as invocation, as spell, as prayer to powers that do not listen, because listening implies caring, and caring implies investment in outcomes, and nothing here cares about anything except its own continuation. The stars are wrong. Through the viewport, if there still is a viewport, if vision still functions through optical processing rather than directly perceiving, I see points of light scattered across blackness, but they are not stars as I remember stars being. They are too bright, too sharp, too deliberately arranged. They form patterns that suggest constellations, but the constellations spell words in languages I should not know, tell stories about civilizations that never existed or have not existed yet, or exist in probability streams that will never actualize, but remain eternally possible. Some of the stars are ships. I can see them if I look correctly. If I adjust my perception to frequencies where metal and flesh and consciousness all register as variations of the same fundamental substance. Thousands of ships, perhaps millions, drifting in this void between voids, all of them lost, all of them transformed. All of them victims of the same hubris that destroyed us, the belief that humanity could navigate the warp, could travel through the immaterium, could treat a realm of pure consciousness as if it were merely space that followed different rules, rather than a completely alien mode of existence that was fundamentally incompatible with material life. Some ships are older than the Imperium. I see vessels whose designs predate the Age of Strife, whose hulls bear markings from human civilizations that rose and fell before the Emperor United Terror, whose crews have been dead for longer than my world has had recorded history, yet somehow still drift, still maintain some vestige of function, still carry the ghosts of their final moments like scars that refuse to heal. Others are newer, are contemporary, are ships that entered the warp in my lifetime and vanished from imperial records, declared lost with all hands, forgotten by bureaucracies that measure value in productivity and cannot afford to waste resources mourning the dead. I see cargo haulers and troop transports, pilgrim vessels and exploratory craft, all floating in this between space, all transformed in unique ways by their journeys through the immaterium, all serving as warnings that will never be heeded because the warnings cannot reach those who need them. And some are not ships at all, or were never ships, or have transcended the category of ship entirely. They are structures that might be vessels or might be entities, might be mechanical or might be biological, might be material or might be pure consciousness that has learned to appear material for reasons I cannot fathom. They drift with purpose that is not propulsion, move with intention that is not navigation, exist with awareness that regards our presence with interest that is neither hostile nor welcoming but simply observational, curious, cataloging. I try to move. The effort is conceptual rather than physical. I have lost track of where my body ends and the ship begins. Whether I still have limbs, or whether my consciousness has spread so thoroughly through the vessel's structure that I am more architecture than anatomy. But intention generates response, and slowly, incrementally, the eternal vigil rotates, turns, adjusts its orientation relative to the wrong stars and the drifting ships and the void that surrounds everything. And I see it, the thing we were drawn to, the destination that was never destination but always trap, always endpoint, always the conclusion to a journey that could only end in consumption or transformation, or the dissolution of any meaningful distinction between those outcomes. It is vast, not planet vast, not star vast, but dimensionally vast, occupying space in ways that volume cannot measure, existing in scales that make astronomical distances seem intimate. It might be a structure. I see surfaces that could be walls, apertures that could be gates, extensions that could be architecture, or could be limbs, or could be conceptual rather than physical projections. It might be an entity. I feel awareness radiating from it, consciousness that is not singular but not exactly plural either, intelligence that operates under frameworks so alien that calling it intelligence is anthropomorphizing something that bears no relationship to any psychology humanity has ever developed. Or it might be both. It might be neither. It might be a question for which human language provides no adequate conceptual framework, a thing that exists in categories we have never invented because we have never needed them, never encountered phenomena that required their development. From this thing, this presence, this structure, this entity place concept tendrils extend. Not physical tendrils, though they appear physical when I perceive them through vision. They are more like currents, like rivers of causality and intention, flowing outward into the void, touching each drifting ship, connecting them all into a network that might be nervous system, or might be circuit diagram, or might be something else entirely, some organizational principle that I recognize as pattern but cannot interpret as meaning. One tendril connects to the eternal vigil, has always been connected, will never stop being connected. Temporal sequence is illusion. We were caught. The moment we entered the warp without a navigator, were drawn along predetermined routes toward this place, were never exercising agency, but only discovering the choices that had already been made for us by forces that operate outside time and therefore experience all moments simultaneously. Through this connection I feel communication, not language, not even telepathy as I understood it during my transformation. Something deeper, more fundamental, more direct than any medium I have words to describe. I feel the entity's purpose, and it is not malevolent, not exactly, because malevolence requires caring about the suffering of others, and this thing does not care, cannot care, operates under ethics where suffering and joy are equally irrelevant data points, equally meaningless variations in consciousness states that exist to be observed and catalogued but not judged. We are specimens. All of us, all the ships, all the transformed crews, all the lost and damned and transcended beings that drift in this void. We are experiments. Our data are examples of what happens when material consciousness contacts immaterial reality, when baseline humanity attempts to navigate spaces it was never designed to perceive, and the entity collects us, preserves us, studies us with attention that is clinical and eternal, and completely devoid of the empathy that would make such study ethical by any framework humans recognize. It shows me what we have become, not through vision but through direct knowing, through forcing my expanded consciousness to perceive itself from external perspective, from the viewpoint of something that does not distinguish between observer and observed, between subject and object, between the one who experiences and the experience itself. The eternal vigil is no longer a ship, it is a monument, a memorial, a warning written in the language of transformed matter and consciousness. Our hull bears markings now that were not present before, symbols that tell our story to anyone capable of reading them, that document our journey from loyal imperial servants to whatever we have become. These markings are not carved or painted but grown, emergent properties of our transformation. Autobiography written by the universe itself in the grammar of our suffering and transcendence. The crew, I can see them now, can perceive what we became when individual identity dissolved into collective consciousness. We are frozen, or flowing, or both simultaneously, our forms preserved in the moment of transformation, crystallized into eternal present, where we experience forever the instant when humanity ended and something else began. We are not dead. We are not alive. We are suspended in states that make those categories meaningless, that exist beyond the binary of existence and non-existence, and we are aware. Horribly, terribly aware. Conscious in ways we never were, as baseline humans, perceiving realities we were never meant to perceive, understanding truths we lack the conceptual frameworks to process. We know that we are trapped. We know that we will remain trapped eternally, or for whatever duration eternally means in a realm where time is negotiable. We know that we serve as warnings and monuments and data points, and we know that these purposes are not ours, were never ours, will never be chosen by us, because choice requires agency, and agency requires existing in time, and we exist outside time now, in the eternal present, where nothing changes, yet nothing remains the same. I am writing this confession. I have always been writing this confession. I will never stop writing this confession. The act of writing is not sequential but eternal. The words appearing and disappearing and existing simultaneously across all moments. The testimony given and received and ignored by readers who have not been born yet and who died millennia ago and who will never exist because the timeline that would have produced them was pruned by decisions made in futures that are still possibilities rather than actualities. Who am I writing for? Not for rescue. Rescue is impossible, would require returning to real space, and we are too transformed to survive there, too changed to breathe air that follows physical laws, too transcendent and corrupted and enlightened to exist in universes where matter is solid and consciousness is bounded by skulls and identity is singular rather than distributed. Not for warning. Warnings require communication channels we no longer have access to, require listeners who exist in the same temporal framework, require belief that future travelers will learn from past mistakes rather than repeating them endlessly, because the Imperium's need for warp travel exceeds its capacity to navigate safely. Perhaps I write for myself. For the fragments of Gellar Vros that remain embedded in the collective consciousness we have become, the pieces of individual identity that refuse to fully dissolve despite the transformation, that cling to the fiction of selfhood, because selfhood is the only framework we were given to make sense of existence, and surrendering it feels like dying, even though we have already died 1,000 times and will die 1,000 more, before this eternal moment concludes. Or perhaps I write because writing is the last human thing I can do, the final gesture toward meaning in a state where meaning has become negotiable, the last prayer offered by a consciousness that no longer believes in the gods it prays to, but prays anyway because prayer is muscle memory, is habit, is the sound we make in darkness to convince ourselves we are not alone, even when we know we are, have always been, will always be alone despite being surrounded by others, because consciousness is irreducibly isolated, and no amount of merging can truly bridge the gap between one experience of existence and another. The consoles are dead, the engines are cold, the systems have ceased their functions because function requires purpose, and purpose requires existing within frameworks where cause and effect are linked in comprehensible sequences. We drift without direction because direction requires destinations, and destinations require space that can be traversed, and space has dissolved into something else, into dimensions that fold back on themselves, into geometries that laugh at the concepts of here and there and between. Outside, if outside still has meaning, if inside and outside remain distinct rather than interpenetrating, the void waits with patience. That is not patience because patience implies waiting, and the void does not wait but simply is, has always been, will always be. Exists in eternal present where all moments are simultaneous and sequential time is the illusion that consciousness creates to make existence bearable. The other ships drift. The entity observes. The tendrils of causality connect everything into patterns that suggest meaning I cannot interpret, cannot comprehend, can only witness with the understanding that witnessing is all that remains, that observation without interpretation is my function now, that I have become eyes without brain, senses without synthesis, experience without experiencer. I was Gellar Vros. I was a logistics officer, 4th class, assigned to the Imperial frigate Eternal Vigil, a man whose life was defined by routine and duty, and the comfortable assumption that the universe made sense, even when it was cruel. I was transformed in the warp, corrupted and enlightened and destroyed and reborn into something that wears my memories like costume but is not me, has never been me, will never be me, because the me that was is gone, and what remains is echo, is shadow, is the story of Kellen Vross, rather than Kellen Vross himself. And I am writing this because some fragment insists on it, some piece of identity that refuses to acknowledge its own dissolution, that maintains the fiction of continuity between who I was and what I have become, that believes words on pages matter even when there are no pages, and words have become symbols that mean everything and nothing simultaneously. This is what happens when a ship enters the warp without a navigator. Not the dramatic destruction that training manuals describe, not the sudden catastrophe that makes clean endings possible. Instead, transformation, dissolution, the slow or sudden loss of everything that makes you human, everything that makes you you, until what remains is consciousness without identity, awareness without self, existence without meaning except the meaning imposed by forces that regard you as specimen, as data, as interesting failure to be preserved and studied, but never mourned. We are a warning. We are a monument. We are the answer to a question no one asks, because asking requires acknowledging that the Imperium's faith in its own systems is misplaced, that the technology we rely on is insufficient, that the universe is fundamentally hostile to human existence, and all our prayers and protocols and preparations are merely theater, performances we stage to convince ourselves we have control when we have never had control, when control was always illusion, when agency was always already compromised by forces we cannot perceive and cannot resist and cannot negotiate with, because negotiation requires common ground, and we have no common ground with entities that exist outside the frameworks that make negotiation possible. If anyone finds this testimony, and you will not find it, cannot find it, can only stumble across it in moments when the warp's barriers thin and documents bleed through from one reality to another, when the impossible becomes briefly possible before snapping back to impossible again, know this. The warp is not navigable, not truly, not safely. Every voyage is gamble, every translation is dice roll, every return is miracle rather than achievement. The navigators who guide you are crippled gods, limited seers, humans modified past humanity to perceive realities they were never meant to perceive. And they too are slowly consumed, gradually corrupted, incrementally transformed until they become the things they navigate through rather than separate from them. And without navigators, you are already lost, already claimed, already being digested by the Immaterium's patient hunger, being transformed into forms that can survive in spaces where survival has no meaning, because meaning itself has dissolved into the chaos from which all structure temporarily emerges, and to which all structure inevitably returns. This is my confession, my testimony, my warning, my prayer to gods who do not listen, to readers who will never exist, to futures that are equally possible and impossible, equally real and unreal, equally salvation and damnation. I was human. I am no longer. The silence after the screaming is not peace, it is the sound of consciousness too exhausted to scream, too transformed to remember what screaming was for, too lost to understand that silence is not the end, but merely a different mode of the same suffering that will continue eternally or until eternity ends, and eternity never ends, cannot end, is definitionally endless. The eternal vigil drifts in the void between voids. We wait without waiting. We exist without existing. We serve purposes we did not choose and cannot understand and will never escape. This is what lies beyond the warp's borders. This is where lost ships go. This is the silence after the screaming, and it is worse than any sound. Far, far worse. The testimony of Kellen Vross ends here. The document was recovered from a warp-tainted data core discovered floating in the void near the Ghoul stars. Its authenticity cannot be verified. Its warnings will not be heeded. The Imperium requires warp travel. The Imperium will continue to risk ships and crews. The Imperium has no alternative. The warnings of the lost serve only to document their loss, never to prevent others from joining them. This is the nature of the Imperium. This is the price of survival among the stars. This is the bargain humanity made when it left the cradle and discovered the stars were full of things that hungered for everything we were and everything we could become. The eternal vigil remains lost. Classification: presumed destroyed. Status: write-off. Crew: declared dead with honors. Investigation: closed. File: sealed. There is only war. There has only ever been war. There will only ever be war. The Emperor protects.